So let's use the standard macroeconomic model developed by Mishkin for thinking about monetary policy, in particular monetary policy to stabilize the economy in response to shocks. So we know that the central bank has a twin or dual mandate. One is to maintain price stability, and the other is to minimize, reduce unemployment. So we'll see whether the tools that the monetary policy makers have, namely changing the real interest rate in response to shocks, whether that tool of changing the real interest rate will be sufficient to maintain a low level of unemployment and maintain price stability in the face of a number of different kinds of shocks. And we'll consider, following Mishkin, Chapter 13, we'll consider three kinds of shocks: permanent aggregate demand shocks, temporary aggregate demand shocks, obviously not very interesting really, because there isn't much to be done. The aggregate demand goes up and then goes down. And we already know monetary policy, by reducing the interest rate, can exactly offset an aggregate demand shock. So there isn't much of interest there. But so we have permanent aggregate demand shocks, permanent aggregate supply shocks, and temporary aggregate supply shocks. And what we'll see is that for the two permanent one, there is no trade-off, in the sense that the appropriate monetary policy can both reduce unemployment or maintain a low level of employment and maintain price stability. But we'll see that for the temporary AS shock, there is a trade-off, and the monetary authority can't do both. So let's first talk about an aggregate demand shock. So if there's no policy response to an aggregate demand shock, the Fed's monetary policy curve staying the same, an aggregate demand shock we represent by shifting to the left of the aggregate demand curve, and so GDP would be lower. So GDP falls. We assume we initially started our potential level of GDP. So GDP falls to Y1, and inflation is lowered because the economy is now in a recession. So while there's no shift of the monetary policy curve, there is a movement along the monetary policy curve. The reduction in inflation leads the central bank, the Fed, to lower the equilibrium real interest rate. So the real interest rate falls from R1 to R2. Now, since GDP is below potential, we have a slack in the labor market, and so the aggregate supply curve starts to shift downwards. And as long as GDP is below potential, the aggregate supply curve will keep shifting downwards. Nothing shifts the aggregate supply curve now until we finally end up back at potential level of GDP at some lower level of inflation. We're measuring inflation here, and interest rates keep falling until we get to some new lower level of interest rates at that lower level of inflation. So with no policy response, we get a decrease in inflation, a decrease in GDP, followed by increase in GDP, and so an increase in unemployment, followed by, over time, a decrease in unemployment. So the central bank, by having no policy, allows unemployment to fluctuate, and inflation deviates from its target. So let's see what the appropriate action for the monetary policy authorities to do with a policy response. So we have a shift to the left of the aggregate demand curve, and what we can imagine now the central bank doing is reducing the R bar target long-term real interest rate, shifting the monetary policy curve down, so that shifts down, and we've already seen that decrease or expansionary monetary policy, a decrease in R bar, is equivalent to shifting out the aggregate demand curve, and so we get back to potential GDP at the same level of inflation, though now at the same level of inflation we'll have a lower real interest rate. Remember that aggregate demand going down means that there's no longer as much demand for present consumption, so real interest rates can then be lower in the economy. So with the appropriate policy response, the Fed can prevent unemployment. So before unemployment starts rising, the Fed pursues its expansionary monetary policy and thus stabilizes the employment market, and inflation stays at the same level. So inflation is stabilized. So this is great. Michigan calls this the divine coincidence. Having a hard time spelling here. Let's erase that. Coincidence. There we go. The divine coincidence. The monetary policy stabilizes inflation and prevents unemployment. That's great. Let's look at permanent supply shock. So in a permanent supply shock, our potential output shifts to the left. If we have no policy response, then our GDP will be above potential level, so we'll have inflation. The aggregate supply curve will shift up, and we'll have gradually falling employment. That is, we'll have higher unemployment, and we're having higher unemployment because our potential level of GDP has declined. Productivity is lower, so there'll be less employment in the economy overall. While this is happening, the inflation rate is rising, so we're moving up the MP curve. We're assuming there's no response. So the real interest rate is rising. So remember, a decrease in aggregate supply means that people want to consume a greater share of the now lower aggregate supply. They want to consume it in the present, and so the interest rate has to be higher for them to consume it in the present, because they want to take away from the future.